Shalom. This week we are reading Parashat Vayeshev, beginning in Bereshit, the book of Genesis, chapter 37. This Torah portion is all about Yakov's favorite son, Joseph, in Hebrew, Yosef, meaning he will add. There's so much intrigue in this story, so many twists and turns, so many issues that defy our attempts to understand on a simple level what's happening here. So much so that it becomes obvious that when it comes to the story of Yosef, there's much more here than meets the eye, and nothing here is intended to be understood simply. Jacob's obvious showing of favoritism to this one son, as the verse states, "Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his sons since he was a child of old age, and he made for him a fine woolen tunic." The terrible enmity that this created. The verse states, his brothers saw that it was he who their father loved most of all his brothers, so they hated him, and they could not speak to him peaceably. To this day, we read these verses with disbelief and shock about what happens next. Yet we also know from a deeper study that the intentions of both the holy tribes of Israel, the brothers, and Yosef were all good, and that their dispute was over the proper way to serve God in this world and fulfill the nation's destiny to deserve the fulfillment of the promises made by the Almighty to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's on a deep level. The second verse of this parsha begins with these words. These are the generations of Yakov, Yosef. In Hebrew, Ele toldot Yakov, Yosef. And then the verse continues, but it can be read, these are the generations of Yakov, Yosef. This really conveys the idea that Yosef is the continuation of Yakov. Yosef is the favorite because he is the torchbearer of Yaakov's mission. That explains their exceptional closeness and what we might interpret on a surface level as favoritism. The gift of the coat was no ordinary gift, but the symbol of the ongoing burden to continue the job of effecting a rectification of mankind, because that coat was originally Adam's, and that's another story. The ensuing story of Yosef's descent to Egypt and his meteoric rise to power there is testimony to the amazing divine providence that guided his every step. Yosef had to end up in Egypt and pave the way for the next stages of history. And in that regard, we could look upon the brothers as merely facilitating that plan. One thing is for sure, we do learn a lot here about how brothers are supposed to behave and how they're not supposed to behave. We learn a lot about trust and relationships and resentment and jealousy and suspicion, and we learn a whole lot of lessons from the relationship of Yosef and his brothers altogether. And I'm not going there today. So all that mystery is another story, but today, there's something else that I would like to focus upon, which is basic to our understanding of Yosef. I'll get to that soon. You know, Yosef is such an enigmatic figure. We're provided with some clues that point us in the right direction towards an understanding of what he's all about, things to ponder. On that verse that I mentioned, these are the generations of Yakov, Yosef, the sages teach us, they say, Yakov took the firstborn status from Reuven and gave it to Yosef. And that Yosef's face was the same face as Yaakov's. These are very enigmatic statements. And don't forget, these teachings are homiletical, they're allegorical. They represent something. But like his mother Rachel, the Torah itself describes Yosef as the personification of physical beauty. Verse chapter 39, verse 6 states, he was handsome of form and handsome of appearance. So he was very human and, if you would, very physical. It was part of his world. He was part of this world. His physicality was expressed by his very presence. It couldn't be denied. And recall that his destiny was to precede his father and brothers in Egypt and prepare the way for them, just as there's a tradition of the forerunner of the Mashiach ben David, the forerunner of the Messiah of David, who is a spiritual, whose mandate is a spiritual mandate. He is preceded by the Mashiach of Yosef, whose job is to prepare for the redemption through physical means. So Yosef has this connection with physicality. And yet, although Yosef himself is identified on some level with physicality, physical beauty is attributed to him, he was exceptionally handsome and attractive, yet he is known as Yosef HaTzadik, Joseph the righteous, in the merit of his withstanding the temptation, the test of his master's wife. And he's one of the very few figures to receive this appellation connected to his name at all times, HaTzadik, the righteous one. Throughout Torah literature, he is identified as the very paragon of virtue. He's testified to by Hashem himself. There's a teaching the sages say, because Yosef sanctified the name of heaven in private, he merited that Hashem added one of the letters of his own name to his name. That's a reference to Psalms 81 and verse 6. We find the verse that states, as a testimony for Jehoseph, his name, when he went forth over the land of Egypt, when I understood a language that I had not known. That's what the verse states. And Yosef in that verse is spelled with a J, or excuse me, in Hebrew with an extra hey. It's spelled Yehosef. Yud Hey Vav Samach Pei. In English it's been translated here as Joseph. But it has an extra letter. It has this Hey. And that letter is from Hashem's own name. And that verse is stating that God himself put that letter there as a testimony to Joseph. We're taught that Yosef was led by divine inspiration from his youth until the very day he died. And lavish praise of the virtue, the purity of Yosef is heaped upon him by our sages. And just as we saw, the verse itself testifies to the name of Yosef with an added hey, it's Hashem himself testifying. Yosef was the archetype of perfection of sexual purity, which doesn't mean that he wasn't tempted, but he withstood the test. And in addition to Potiphar's wife, Midrash relates that he was constantly set upon and pursued by beautiful women who tried to get his attention, and he would not even look at them. And this is why he is called Yosef the HaTzadik, the Tzadik Yisod Olam. It comes from a verse in Proverbs. It's a standard, a benchmark. It's an idea that the Tzadik is the foundation of the world. And that's why we'll see, as the story progresses, that Yosef is the only one who was able to gather the food to save the nation of Egypt and ultimately his own family. The Egyptians also tried to gather food, but it all rotted away under their hands. But Yosef was pure. So the sages teach, Yosef the tzaddik is the pillar of the world, meaning that sexual purity is the pillar of the world. And thus, the Talmud states, his enemies fall before him. And back in the confrontation between Yakov and Esau, when he was bringing all his camp, Yakov, Genesis 33 tells us, afterwards, Yosef and Rachel approached and bowed down. They were the last in the procession. And the verse says, Yosef and Rachel. Because, according to Midrash, Yosef said, this wicked one's eyes are haughty, meaning Esau. He should not look upon my mother. I'll block his view. Parashat Vayeshev ended with a vast array of all the alufim, the chieftains of all of the families, the descendants of Esau. And then right away, Parashat Vayeshev informs us in verse 2 of chapter 37, these are the generations of Yakov, Yosef. Rashi tells us that this is a connection. He cites the Midrash teaching us that this verse, these are the generations of Yaakov Yosef, is a continuation of the listing of those Esavian chieftains. Why? Because Yaakov saw all these alufim, all these chieftains of Esau, and he said, he shook, who's going to conquer all of these? Who could stand up to this might? And thus it states, these are the generations, meaning the continuation of Yaakov Yosef. And the Midrash continues, as it states, in Ovadiah, chapter 1 and verse 18, very important verse for our current study. And the house of Jacob shall be fire, and the house of Joseph a flame, and the house of Esau shall become stubble. Now open up your heart in the deepest way. This week's Torah portion of Vayeshev centers on Yosef, but of course he was born in Parashat Vayeshev 2 weeks ago. Now the emphasis of last week's Torah portion, Vayeshev, of course, is the reunion, Yaakov's confrontation with Esau. But in fact, as soon as Yosef was born, apparently that moment, Yaakov was ready to leave Lavan and confront Esau again. These verses seem strange. We find Genesis chapter 30, verses 22-25. God remembered Rachel, God hearkened to her and opened her womb, and she conceived and bore a son and said, God has taken away my disgrace. So she called his name Yosef, meaning, may Hashem add on for me another son. And there in chapter 30 in Parashat Vayeshev, verse 25, right away, unbelievably, the verse continues, and it was, when Rachel had given birth to Joseph, Jacob said to Lavan, grant me leave that I may go to my place and to my land. And these words certainly make it clear that now that Joseph is here, I'm ready to go. Why? Why? What is it about Joseph that somehow signaled a new era, that made Yakov confident that he could now face Esau? Indeed, Rashi, citing the sages, states emphatically that as soon as Joseph was born, Jacob trusted in the Holy One, blessed be He, and desired to return to the land of Canaan. Because Joseph is called Sitno Shel Esau. Joseph is called the adversary of Esau. And continues Rashi, and when he was born, it was now possible to confront Esau, because, as Rashi cites the verse in Obadiah, chapter 1, verse 18, and the house of Jacob shall be fire, and the house of Joseph a flame. The house of Esau shall become stubble. This verse, by the way, was read in the Haftarah of Parashat Vayeshev, read last week. Rashi explains on this verse, fire without a flame doesn't burn anything at a distance. Okay, so Yakov is a fire, Joseph is a flame, Esau is straw. What is this? What is this that Joseph is the Sitno Shel Esau? He is the adversary of Esau, and indeed there's a tradition that Esau only falls to the descendants of Joseph. What's this all about? Why is Joseph considered to be Esau's adversary? And the analogy of the fire and the flame and Esau's straw, I mean, as if to say that Esau's destruction is dependent upon Yosef. That's what the verse in Obadiah is telling us. Why fire and straw? Why isn't the metaphor, if the example is fire, why couldn't Esau be likened to fire and Yosef to water? What is this? What is the Torah teaching us here? In any event, a fire would be sufficient to ignite the straw. Why the emphasis on a flame? What does this mean? Fire burns in its own place, but the flame is needed to burn at a distance. Now, I already know one thing, past few weeks, right? The struggle between Yakov and Esau, personified by the struggle between Yakov and the angel of Esau, it has a meaning for all time. It's a perpetual struggle, as we learned. And the meaning between Esau and Yakov has significance and meaning for all time and every generation, and therefore, apparently, so does the role of Yosef. I was having a hard time trying to understand what's the difference between a fire and a flame. What I found as a definition of a flame is a hot, glowing body of ignited gas that is generated by something on fire. A few weeks back, we learned that through Esau's duplicity, through his fraudulent behavior, back in Toldot, chapter 25 and verse 28, we learned the verse, Kitzayed befiv, that his game was in his mouth, but actually we learned that it really means Esau hunted with his mouth. He hunted Yitzchak with his mouth. Esau manipulated Yitzchak into thinking that he sincerely wanted to serve God in this world, and thus Yitzchak wanted to give the blessings to Esau because he felt that Esau would be able to serve God through the physical and elevate it, which is a very desirable thing, bring Hashem's presence into this physical world. He hoped that Esau would be able to serve God in this manner because Esau was very physical, ruddy, hairy, finished, earthy. And this earth is the world that we live in and where Hashem put us to serve Him. So Yitzchak was hoping, /thinking, /praying, a man of the earth. He can serve God through the earth. But Esau was totally physical, mistake that Yitzchak made, with no willingness to fuse the physicality with godliness. On the contrary, he and those who follow in his way seek to drive God from this world. But you see, you have to be on fire for something. What's it going to be? In a manner of speaking, it could be said that Esau had a fire. He was on fire. He was on fire for this world. The fire of his power was in the klipa, the husk of impurity, self-gratification and hedonistic and selfish fulfillment, personified by the verse, embodied by the verse, give me some of this red stuff. Therefore his name is called Red. Thus Esau is a man of the sword. When Yitzchak blessed him, he said, by your sword you shall live, back in chapter 27 and verse 40. But you know what? When Hashem expelled Adam from the garden, back in Genesis, we learned there. And he drove the man out, and he stationed from the east of the Garden of Eden the cherubim and the blade of the revolving sword to guard the way of the tree of life. In Hebrew, this is lahat hacherev hamitapechet, the blade of the revolving sword. And as we had occasion to mention in that week, the word lahat, which is translated in this verse for blade, also means flame. Esau's flame was the flame of the sword. It was a fire for evil. But as we are taught in Ecclesiastes chapter 7 and verse 14, Et zeh lumat zeh asah Elokim. God made one corresponding to the other. And that's a reference to the fact that there's a realm of evil and a realm of good. But don't get nervous. They're both right here. Right here. We can choose them. There's evil and there's good. Yosef had a power too. He had a flame in the realm of holiness because he chose to use it for holiness. So he chose the realm of holiness because he took his physicality and brought it up to Hashem and never allowed it to bring him down. Yosef's flame, if Esau's flame was alluded to by the verse of the flame of the sword, Yosef's flame was alluded to in the Song of Songs, in the verse that says, place me like a seal on your heart, like a seal on your arm, for love is as strong as death, zeal is as strong as the grave. Its coals are coals of the fire of a great flame. In Hebrew, rishafeha, its coals, rishafeh, are coals of eish shalhevet, the fire of a great flame. But interestingly, the word here, shalhevet, translated as a great flame, literally means the flame of God. So a fire only burns in one place, but a flame burns something at a distance. Yosef's flame conveys holy fire. Yosef has power. Yakov said, who could conquer these alufim, these chieftains of Esau? These are the generations of Yakov, Yosef. Yosef, the flame of Yosef's holy fire can carry to Mount Seir. His flame is the fire of love of Hashem, and he can nullify Esau's power. And that's what it means. That's why Yakov was ready to run and meet Esau head on as soon as Yosef was born. Because Yosef is the sitno shel Esau. And the sages tell us the moment he was born, the adversary of Esau was born. Because Yosef is all about serving Hashem in this world through this fire, this holy fire of passion for Hashem. Yosef is literally the flame of this fire. And thus, he descended into the heart of the fire of impurity, the spiritual darkness of the land of Egypt, known to be the land of impurity and immorality, and he fought fire with fire. And through the purity of his own fire, he subdued those negative energies and brought them into the realm of holiness. He withstood every test. Yaakov knew he could. Thus, when he gazed upon Esau's chieftains, he feared not, readied himself for the confrontation. We're about to observe the holiday of Hanukkah. The antagonist of the Hanukkah story is the wicked king Antiochus, whose army invaded the land of Israel, defiled the holy temple, and enacted decrees against Israel studying Torah, observing Shabbat and Rosh Chodesh, the new moon, and circumcising the male children. All these decrees that were designed to separate Israel from God and to hide God's presence in this world. The Greek war against Israel was not a war against Israel or the culture of Israel. It was a war against the God of Israel and the culture of his Torah. And the Greek invaders sought to force Israel to accept their worldview, namely the beauty of the body and the truth of the beauty of the physical, only as can be proven through science and nature. It's no coincidence that this Torah portion generally falls out in the proximity of Hanukkah. And it's no coincidence that the word Yosef has the same gematria, the same numerical value. It's a method of interpreting the Torah. It's very deep. The letters of the word Yosef have the same numerical value as the name Antiochus, the king, and even has the same numerical value as the words Melech Yavan, the king of Greece. Because Yosef's experience in Egypt teaches us that to subdue the forces of Yavan, meaning the forces of the fire, of sheer physicality and the worship of the superficial, the Esavian obsession with the body and immediate murderous, lustful self-gratification, the way to subdue that is through the flame of Yosef, the fire of the passion of the love of Hashem. May we all be blessed with a happy Hanukkah, light-filled holiday of Hanukkah, filled for all of us with the love of Hashem.